thank you all for being here. And we're going to try to make this topical. And we're prepared to take your questions on whatever you want after we talk about the book a little bit. But the first question I wanted to ask Michael, okay, this is The Fight to Vote, steeped in constitutional history. Of course, your biography of the Second Amendment, same thing. And I just have to ask you, it's a question on the top of my mind today. When the framers were debating whether or not to limit the right to vote to landholders, did they ever contemplate a candidate like Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, George, let me thank you, George, for doing this. Your generosity is tremendous, and folks should know that George is kind enough to do this after covering the Oscars, then flying east, anchoring 2 shows last night on Super Tuesday and Good Morning America. Yeah. So we'll do our best to keep you awake. And
I might have to erase a little bit of the tape if I say something crazy.
Exactly. I'll see what I can get out of you. In so many ways, the democracy we are now, the country we've become, was beyond the comprehension, beyond the imagination of the framers and the people at the Constitutional Convention. The rule of thumb at the time was that only white men who owned property could vote. And that was a rule handed down to them from the Middle Ages, from England. But they knew even then that there was building pressure.
And the idea was somebody had to have a stake in society?
That you had to be able to be independent enough to have a stake in society. And John Adams, who wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, and Ben Franklin actually took opposite points of view on this. Ben Franklin, both inside the walls of the convention and publicly, fought for an expanded right to vote. He led a working man's revolt in Pennsylvania in 1776 to get wider voting rights. Basically, the only place in the colonies that the revolution really looked kind of like the French Revolution, with big crowds of pitchfork-wielding people. And inside the Constitutional Convention, he blocked any effort to enshrine the wealthy as the only ones who could vote or serve in office. John Adams was not there, but he worried very much about expanding the right to vote to the kind of thing we see today. He said that if you do that, he said, women will want the vote. Lads will think their interests insufficiently attended to, and they will want the vote. And men who have not a farthing to their name will think themselves due an equal voice in government. He said there will be no end of it. And of course, that is exactly the kind of thing that's happened over 2.5 centuries. But they actually did worry about people like Donald Trump. They worried that if there was too much democracy, they were worried about Cromwell or dictatorial figures from the past. And James Madison privately worried that if everybody had the right to vote, then people would follow someone of, quote, opulence and ambition, who would lead them astray. But publicly, the power of the democratic ideal, the power of the idea that government was legitimate only if it rested on, as Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, on the consent of the governed, forced them to put aside their qualms. And they began this journey with a recognition that the core democratic ideal was at the heart of what the American experiment was about.
You know, yesterday's election was also the first election since the Voting Rights Act. Parts of the Voting Rights Act were overturned. You've had significant new restrictions on voter ID laws in several of the states. How did it play out?
I've been looking into the question of how things went yesterday, and the polls, of course, closed less than 24 hours ago. Part of my answer is, you all may have heard the story, Zhou Enlai, the Chinese communist premier, was asked what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said, it's too soon to tell. So part of my answer is, it's too soon to tell. There are scattered reports of people being turned away, long lines in poorer communities. But the real answer probably is that turnout is so low in primaries that the worst challenges that come from some of these laws might not be felt. A place like Texas, for example, we know a federal court has ruled that there are 608,000 eligible and registered voters who did not have the kind of specific ID required by the state. This was one of the laws that it was 2 hours after the U.S. Supreme Court in the Shelby County case gutted the Voting Rights Act on the basis that it was no longer needed. 2 hours later, Texas pushed through its voter ID rule. And this was the rule that said that in Texas, you cannot use your University of Texas ID as your government ID, but you can use your concealed carry gun permit. So it's very carefully crafted. And we know that there are hundreds of thousands of real and not theoretical voters who are affected. We don't know whether they will be trying to turn out to vote in the general election.
We've also seen in the last few years, this has been a very partisan fight. And one of the lessons of your book and one of the things you found is that fights over the right to vote in our country have always been deeply partisan fights.
Yeah, you know, one of the reasons that I wrote this book, and I should acknowledge my editor Alice Mayu and colleagues from Simon & Schuster who are here who encouraged this. I wanted to understand, I'm involved in these fights every day, is this new and why is it happening now? And it turns out we've been fighting about this from the beginning. It didn't start last year. It didn't start 50 years ago in Selma. It's a fight that's been going on for 240 years. There have always been people pushing for a greater voice, and there have always been people pushing back, trying to stop it, and it's been frequently raw and rowdy and partisan. It turns out that it's always been political, often at the center of elections. For Americans today who are sort of wince at polarization and at parties, in fact, political parties turned out to play a very significant and often very positive role.
What's the positive role?
Well, the first great expansion of the right to vote was in the 1820s, after that period when only white men with property could vote, and it was to white men without property. In other words, the first great voting rights victory was what we would call the white working class. And this was fought and won by the Democratic Party. It was the world's first mass political party under savvy party insiders like Martin Van Buren of upstate New York. And that was not won, in that instance, by a citizen movement or voting rights marches, but by politicians who saw that this was in their interest. The Republican Party, after the Civil War, fought to extend the vote to African Americans, to former slaves, partly for their self-interest electorally, and there was idealism as well. And so you saw this over and over again through history, that we might not like parties, Americans, but in fact they've turned out to be pretty useful when they work well as mobilizing forces and even as democratizing forces.
You mentioned the Civil War. Fascinating story in the book. John Wilkes Booth, actually motivated in part by, it's a voting rights dispute.
There are heroes and villains in this story, some of whom we know. We didn't know Ben Franklin played that role, and some of whom were sort of surprise entrants. And John Wilkes Booth was a surprise to me. Abraham Lincoln was not a supporter of extending voting rights to African Americans. He had actually spoken out against it. But as we know, he changed, and he changed in the course of the Civil War. And his first stabs at Reconstruction didn't enfranchise the former slaves. But by the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of black men had served in uniform in the U.S. military. And a few days after the surrender of the South at Appomattox, Lincoln spoke from the second floor window of the White House and gave his big speech about what he wanted to have happen with Reconstruction. And he said, you know, people have criticized my policies for not extending the vote to the former slaves. I now agree. And he called for the vote for those who'd served in the military or who were educated, and his aides even thought he was going to go further. At least one member of the audience caught the significance of the shift. John Wilkes Booth was there, and he gasped, "That means citizenship." That is the last speech he is ever going to give. And he tried to get the person right next to him to shoot Lincoln on the spot. And when the person wouldn't do it, he said, well, then I'm going to put him through myself. And 2 days later, went to Ford's Theater. So I don't think he was a fan of President Lincoln going into that. I don't want to, but it was the motivating factor. And it was never far from people's minds because there were many countries in the world that ended slavery in the 19th century. But the United States was actually the only one that immediately tried to enfranchise the former slaves.
What are the other broad lessons you draw from studying the history about the movements to expand the right to vote, particularly the movement to give women the right to vote?
The movement to give women the right to vote was fascinating because it brought together a lot of the ways we've fought as a country to make the democracy meaningful. You know, after the Civil War, after there was this brief flowering of democracy with African Americans being able to vote, things really moved backwards in the late 1800s. In the South and even in the North, where there was a crackdown on voting by immigrants, where people were worried not about some of the immigrant groups today that people talk about, but Irish and Italian and European immigrants. And there was a real narrowing of what democracy meant. The period after that, the Progressive Era, was a response to that, and a creative and exciting time of ferment where the Americans of the time, and it reminds me now of a lot of the concerns we have, people felt their government was broken. They felt it was corrupt and not up to the tasks. They were worried about demographic change and economic change, and they thought restoring the vote and making democracy work was part of the answer. So part of it was this sense of social change, and the other thing is often the expansion of democracy and the expansion of the right to vote has come when there's a military conflict. And World War I was one of the issues for the women. But the story of how women won the right to vote, we tend to skip over that. It's often said in textbooks that they got the right to vote, and then you move on to the more dramatic fights. And it actually turns out to be the case, not surprisingly, that it was every bit as hard fought and every bit as difficult as any other voting rights fight that we've ever had. We all know the Seneca Falls Declaration of 1848, where women said we need the right to vote. That's our goal. But not a whole lot happened after that, really. A handful of young women in their late 20s, some of them had been in graduate school in England and part of the very dramatic suffrage movement there. They said, we're going to do something really audacious. We're going to pass a constitutional amendment. And just a few months after they started doing this, Woodrow Wilson, the president-elect, got off his train in Washington to be greeted for his inauguration and looked around, and there was nobody there. There was the Princeton Glee Club. That was it. And his aide said, where are all the people? And they were told somewhat sheepishly that they were all down at Pennsylvania Avenue. There was a march for women's voting rights for the 19th Amendment. 5,000 women, led by a woman in a costume of a Greek goddess on a white horse, demanding voting rights, and surrounding them 100,000 men lining Pennsylvania Avenue, many of them drunk because they were there for the inauguration. And the men started heckling, throwing things. They broke through the lines and attacked the women. 100 women went to the hospital. It was a big deal. The police chief of Washington, D.C. had to resign. It got a ton of publicity. It sort of overshadowed Wilson's inaugural. And public opinion swung in support of women's voting rights. And I'm sure many people will think, well, that sounds just like Selma. The violence directed at marchers in a publicized way, galvanizing public opinion. And so many of the steps taken later by social change movements were pioneered by the women. This was before Gandhi, this was before the labor movement really got hold, and certainly before the modern civil rights movement. They followed this with picketing of the White House for 2 years, and hunger strikes, and they were forming a new political party, a whole host of activities, and they finally won the right to vote.
And it does take hard politics. Another point you make is that you can't expect, and we haven't been able to expect, courts to really do the job of either protecting or expanding the right to vote.
You know, those of us of a certain age perhaps grew up thinking that the Supreme Court is going to be the ultimate protector of our liberties. And in fact, throughout most of American history, it's been AWOL in the fight for democracy. The courts actually stayed out of a lot of these fights because they were too political. Briefly, during the 1960s, the Supreme Court did step up and say we needed one person, one vote. The idea that there had to be equality of a voice and that you couldn't have legislative districts that just cut people out of power. But mostly the courts stayed out of it. Most of the constitutional change has actually happened, for example, with amendments. The phrase, the right to vote, does not exist in the original Constitution, but it's been in 5 separate amendments since then. So to me, that makes the current role of the Supreme Court more problematic and more troubling.
I want to ask you about that. In your day job, you run the Brennan Center. We now have this huge vacancy, 4-4 split court right now. It appears unlikely that President Obama's pick is going to get through. But what are the implications, particularly the issues you're working on?
Well, the Supreme Court mostly has stayed out of this issue. And it's no surprise to anybody that the Roberts Court is conservative and, in fact, in many respects, is activist. But where it's been truly activist, truly interventionist, and some people would say radical, has been in the area of democracy law. And you know a lot of these cases. Citizens United in 2010 knocked down arguably a century of campaign finance law. There were a number of other cases that did similar things. In 2013, the case Shelby County, which gutted, in my view, struck down the provision that was the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was the law, the most successful civil rights law we've had in the country, that said that states with a history of discrimination in voting practices needed to get approval in advance before they could change their practices. And it's changed the country in so many ways for the better. The Supreme Court struck that down on the view that it was not really needed anymore. There was a deeply disturbing, in my view, moment during the arguments for that case, where the late Justice Scalia said that, in his view, the Voting Rights Act was nothing more than, quote, a racial entitlement. And you hear, there are tapes now of the arguments, and you can hear everyone in the room gasp. It was a sentiment that I feel, while not in the actual opinion, the opinion mirrored way too much of that. And in fact, many states have changed their voting laws as soon as they had the opportunity to. These opinions, these democracy opinions, are in the front of mind for so many people. You know, when you think about other debates about the Supreme Court and other times in American history, for example, when the nomination occurred for Robert Bork, when he was chosen by President Reagan to serve on the court, there was a big fight over it. And a lot of it revolved around the issue of the right to privacy and Roe versus Wade. Right now, Citizens United especially is the most unpopular decision in the country. It's bipartisan in the disdain people hold for it, according to all the polls. And at least two of the candidates, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, have effectively said it would be a litmus test for them on who they appoint. So these democracy...
When for so long, both Democrats and Republicans had tried not to name any case
right.
as a litmus test, and they really highlight that.
They highlight it, and it's popular with a lot of people. And it's a new moment where these democracy law issues are not only going to be in the middle of a nomination fight or nomination pantomime, whatever it's going to be over the next year, but a presidential election revolving around who's on the Supreme Court.
Doesn't Trump kind of argue the opposite? He's not spending any money, doesn't have any super PACs. He's leading in the fight for the nomination right now, despite the fact that Jeb Bush's super PAC had $100-something million to spend against him. It doesn't appear that these super PACs, at least at the presidential level, have had the impact people fear.
You're right that it's been a sort of a topsy-turvy election in that way. Trump is self-financing and barely
not even spending any money.
Yeah. Bernie Sanders is financing his campaign through small contributions. Jeb Bush managed to blow through $100 million and didn't even get a souvenir mug to show for it. You know, so a lot of the verities about money's going to buy the election and that it's an open and shut matter, they're not at least not yet. They're not yet the case. Now, over the next few weeks, we may see what happens when some of the Republican super PACs, which have not been spending their money against Trump,
all of a sudden,
open
last
up
3
on
days,
him.
yeah.
But we don't know. What we do know is this. First of all, below the level of the presidency, below the level of the race where all eyes are on the candidates, and in some ways the money matters less, this phenomenon of outside money and concentrated money
and secret money,
secret money, dark money as it's known, has changed the way campaigns are financed. For Congress, for governor, the further down you get, the louder the money talks. And in the last election, so people ask, well, there was always a lot of money, and there was always a lot of money. People like me were always yelling about all the money, so, why is this any different? What Citizens United allowed was unlimited contributions in effect, as long as it was purportedly independent of the candidate. But in fact, these committees really aren't independent. And so in effect, it was a deregulation. It also allowed corporations to give directly, although that's turned out to be a little less significant. Mm-hmm. In the last election, the top 100 donors to federal campaigns gave as much as the 4.75 million small donors combined. And that's a level of concentration of who gives
Well, and we have
that we
seen
haven't
this,
seen since the Gilded Age.
this brand new development, which is over the last two presidential elections, these billionaires almost becoming the single funders for certain candidates. Now, you
Right.
could argue maybe it's not so bad. Maybe they don't have any particular interest they're looking for. It's just kind of vanity. But it is something brand new.
Well, and you know, in the last election especially, remember with Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, you had billionaires sponsoring candidates like they were racehorses, you know, and a little bit less so this time.
Well, Ted Cruz has, I'm blanking on his name right now, but the guy from Long Island, he's
Yeah.
basically funding one super PAC.
Right, right. And so, you know, I'm not worried that too much money is being spent in politics. Often that can be a good thing. I'm worried about what the politicians think they have to do to get the money. Because the impact is on policy, it's on what kinds of things our government does, who it benefits, and often that kind of stuff, as you know, it happens outside the public eye. There's often technical matters that don't matter very much to ordinary voters, or even things we necessarily understand that might matter a great deal to someone who's given a lot of money to a super PAC supporting a candidate.
Put your White House hat back on and imagine you're in the room with President Obama this week as he's trying to finalize his decision on who to pick. It does appear, you know, he meets with Senator McConnell and Senator Grassley yesterday. They say, well, there's no way there's going to be a hearing. We're not even going to meet with the person. It's open and shut. We have the votes. So he's faced with the choice of what kind of message he's going to send with the person he picks. Does he then, in your view, is it wiser to go with the unimpeachable judge who's got bipartisan credentials, has already been confirmed 97-0, or with someone who's going to send more of a message to mobilize voters who care about the kind of issues you've been working on?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer, in the sense that some of the judges have been, whose names have been floated, were confirmed unanimously recently, and it would put the Senate on the spot as being unconscionably obstructionist.
But they
arguably.
seem impervious
but
to that.
They don't seem to care that much about that. A candidate who would be, it needs to be somebody who's qualified. It needs to be somebody who could be a plausible and good justice. But it may also be something important to recognize. This is going to be a year-long morality play about the Constitution, and that whoever is willing to take the perhaps thankless job of being nominated is going to have to be ready to play their role. It's one of the interesting moments, and you remember from past Supreme Court appointments, many presidents want to break the idea that only judges can be appointed to the Supreme Court. Throughout most of American history, it was former senators, former governors, all kinds of people with a lot of real-world experience. Nowadays, it's almost all former judges who are former law professors.
At Harvard or Yale.
Who went to Harvard or Yale and lived in New York City. But other than that, which, you know, not... Staten Island has no justice on the Supreme Court right now, but that's about it.
Well, now we may have two New York candidates too. So
yeah, well, that's true. That's very true. I don't. You know, I don't know whether President Obama would be tempted to try to make that point. Although I think people have grown up so much right now with the idea that it needs to be a judge that I don't know how people would react to that.
yeah, that's a good point. Why don't we open it up? Who's got some questions?
So I work for an organization, Headcount, that amongst other things, we register people to vote at concerts and music festivals across the country. I just want to know, what if you could do anything, how would you make it easier for people to register to vote?
Well, thank you for doing what you do. Maybe we should repeat the questions for the video, but it was registering people at concerts and what can be done to make it easier for people to vote. One of the greatest obstacles to participation in our country is this ramshackle voter registration system that we have, which is the only major democracy where the onus is put pretty much entirely on private actors, whether it's the voter or political party or registration group. What I think we ought to do is move to a new paradigm of modernizing our voter registration system. If the government took on the responsibility of making sure we had universal and automatic registration, like Canada has, and England and Germany, and really the rest of the world, it would really change things quite a bit. It would add 50 million people to the rolls. It would cost less, and for people who are worried about election fraud and voter fraud, it would actually help protect against that too. And the good news is actually, part of what gives me hope at this moment is there's a lot of ferment. All the focus on these issues does not only lead to despair, but actually some activism. And states now around the country have started to enact versions of this. California and Oregon in the last year. New Jersey legislature just did that, and it was actually vetoed by Governor Christie, but is likely to be overturned. So there's real progress, and that would just, we have an underinvestment in our democracy, and that would be a big,
How critical do you think are other kinds of reforms, like expanding, we've seen a lot of it, expanding early voting, mail voting, make it a national holiday, weekend voting?
You know, I think these are, there are a lot of good ways to do this. I mean, if you view it in like a customer service model, early voting is tremendously popular. And a lot of the places like Ohio, where there were, in 2004, you remember, very long lines, especially in minority communities, they actually fixed it so that you don't have that because of early voting. Although early voting has become a partisan football now in terms of which days the voting takes place.
Right. Not only a partisan football, but one of the things we're learning in this presidential election, we're seeing a pretty wide disparity, at least in the Republican primary so far, between the early vote and the late vote in terms of who people are choosing. Is that
and who do the early
Trump
votes?
is doing very, very well in the early vote, and he's tending to lose votes in the final 3 days before primaries.
Isn't that it? Well, partly it's motivated voters, and partly it's people get last-minute buyer's remorse. Yeah, it's a, and that was true for President Obama also. His voters came out early, and it's also a way to organize. It's an organizing device. Early voting, making it a holiday, I think would be a good idea. A lot of people can't get off from work, but I think of federal holidays might be wherein a lot of people still have to work. So
right.
There is a whole bunch of different ways. Something I'm not for is internet voting. Actually voting, at this point to vote on the internet, it seems way too risky in terms of hackability and the risk of North Korea pushing a button.
I'm with you on that one.
And the Heritage Foundation agrees with me on that one, or I agree with them.
One question I have is, for all the things that we can do to make it easier to register to vote, for example, America still has one of the lowest percentages of voter turnout, even as a percentage of registered voters. In a lot of other democracies, I know Australia off the top of my head, voting is actually mandatory, it's required by law. So what do you think about doing that in America?
So the question was, what about mandatory voting as in Australia and some other places? And President Obama, as you may know, has floated this as an idea. I can strongly see the arguments for it in the sense that I have to pay my taxes, I have to serve on a jury, register for the Selective Service, so why not do this important function? Honestly, I think we're too libertarian a country to ever have something like that. But the broader point you make, which is all these barriers are important, but people still don't vote even if there aren't the barriers. Voter turnout in the last election was the lowest it's been in 72 years. And turnout now is even pretty low.
On the Democratic side, it's very low. On the Republican, it's fairly high right now.
Well, maybe that goes to the question of what causes people to turn out. If there's a reason to vote for something or vote against something or someone or a cause
and turnout
or a person.
was relatively high in 2008.
When you had Obama and Hillary Clinton in that mesmerizing primary. I mean, George, the question I have for you is you've been on the road and really in the thick of covering this. It seems as if this is one of those moments where there's deep and underlying public anger that the kind of political establishment didn't quite catch until this moment.
Completely missed.
And this is one of those elections where the voters are sort of crashing the party.
There's just no question about that. And we were talking about this last night. It is hard to find anyone. Some people will now say, "Oh yeah, I saw how powerful Trump would be." It's hard to find anyone who studied elections for the last generation who felt he would get beyond the first couple of primaries. And in part because of, you were talking about how you became impressed by political parties. A lot of the academics who'd studied this, analysts who'd studied this, had come to believe that parties really were determining who the candidates were through the whole run-up before the primary started, between how you raise money, how you get attention, who can get through into the final phases, and Trump has blown that open.
Well, it's interesting because this is they call it the parties choose thesis, which is admirably plain English for political science too. But in part, this is at least in part an end product of the forces we've seen in the Republican Party, especially, where these outside forces deposed Eric Cantor, deposed the Speaker of the House. In other words, to the degree that the party choosing requires kind of consent within the party and support for the leadership. That's
the leadership is
actually been
hated right now. I mean that's why this could be such a profound change. I mean, if Trump actually does get the nomination, it's the end of the Republican Party that we've all grown up with, that we've all lived with. I mean, he is running in defiance of the leaders in Washington, of their last three presidential candidates, of their last president. I mean, think about how, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine any nominee in any party, in any election I've worked in, where he says, I think the last president of my party should have been impeached.
Right.
And you then go and win a primary 3 days later.
In South Carolina.
It's crazy.
The state that had rescued
after
George
attacking
W.
the
Bush's
previous candidate as a loser because he was captured in the Vietnam War.
Right. And it's interesting because, we've seen social movements and political movements like this in other countries in recent years. In a sense, this is, at least in part, the product of the Great Recession, as well as all the social change and demographic change. But in Europe, you've got the National Front in France, or UKIP in England, and other sort of right-wing nativist populist parties. And as you know, Donald Trump's economic views are not those of the Club for Growth. He defends entitlements and Social Security. He's against free trade deals. And so this is where the power of the vote comes in ways that we see in some other elections, where sometimes big social forces move, and it isn't always gradual. It can be seismic.
And one of the things you've seen, it's undercutting the power of the parties, and this goes to your question in some ways about registration. I mean, he's done much better in those states that have open registration, that have last day of registration, where people can come in and just switch parties on the day of the primary, and because he's just scrambling the normal coalitions.
And there are other examples where out-of-the-box candidates have done especially well, where voters have a chance to show up without having to be ready.
Jesse
to
Ventura
pick in Minnesota, without having to choose months in advance which party they support.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm just curious to hear your viewpoint. There's a lot of angst in terms of people voting, in terms of, does my vote count? Is there too much money and influence in politics? And there's been obviously a very well-documented, issues with regard to Citizens United and the influence of money in politics. But I think a larger issue is, what about the revolving door of politicians going from where they work into Wall Street or into the pharma industry and then back into politics and the lobbying that goes on and the influence? And I think in terms of voting, it just seems like it's so off-putting, it's so corrupt, and it's so, I mean, you mentioned, the name slips me, but the Cantor, who was a very powerful congressman, and what's he doing? He's lobbying, right? Tread lock, he's lobbying. So should there be a moratorium or a period of time between when you serve in office and when you can serve in the private sector, and how that influences? And I'd be curious to hear, obviously you're well-versed in this, how has that developed historically? Has that always been the case?
Well, there are limits like that in the executive branch, and the ultimate truth of this is that very frequently those kinds of rules however tight they seem to be or intended to be, don't ultimately work so well.
Yeah, there's actually there's a year. I think it's a year.
Yeah.
More waiting period before you can lobby your agency, and even longer ones for direct lobbying of the office you worked in. But the way they've gotten around it now is that now a former senator, a former administration official, instead of registering as a lobbyist, they register as a senior advisor to the lobbying firm, and then they give the information, they advise the people who actually go and meet with the congressman.
But there is a big change that's happened in a way that I think people don't realize, which is that now, I don't want to mangle the statistic, but if I did, I'll deny I ever said it. But I think half the senators who leave the Senate now become lobbyists within a few years. And that is a tremendous change from an earlier time. And I think that you're right, it isn't only the campaign money, although the campaign money is entwined a great deal with the lobbying. But it's this broad sense that people have that the political system is not meeting public needs, and that it is also sort of marinating in its own juices and corruption. And the other time when it felt that way, again, was back in the progressive era especially. And they took steps to deal with it. And we don't even realize that that's what they were doing.
But it's actually the through line, one of the through lines that connects Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump.
Right.
They're both speaking to this idea that the system is rigged against people who don't have influence, who don't have power. They have different answers to it. You know, Trump's answer is, I'm too rich to be bought. And Sanders has just said, you know, we need a revolution to fix it. But they're speaking to the same kind.
And when you talk
anger.
to their voters, are their voters speaking in similar terms?
Oh, rigged comes up constantly.
On both Trump
Yeah.
and Sanders. That's really interesting. So, I mean, the challenge, for example, for Hillary Clinton, if the current trends look likely to hold, I can make a bold prediction that she's likely to win the Democratic, more likely than Sanders to win the nomination.
It's pretty much wrapped it up. Actually, I can say
Okay,
that.
well, I don't want to get you in trouble. But how does somebody like her, who has very strong policy proposals that she's put out on this, but is clearly much less comfortable making that argument for many reasons, how does somebody like her ride the wave and actually become an action force? Because that's what, you know, that's the way change often happens.
And do it in an authentic way.
In an authentic way, and without
I think it's one of the issues that's
upended.
bedeviled her campaign. It's how, you know, how can someone who's been an established figure for so long in politics at the highest levels of government be a voice, be a force for change?
But the best politicians figure out how to be the insider and the voice for the outsiders too, and that'll be her challenge.
Yeah.
You know.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
I want to go back to the question of the Supreme Court fight and share an observation and get your feedback. There's this presumption that Obama is powerless if the Republicans in the Senate vow not to even hold a confirmation hearing. When in actuality, he has an immense negative power to affect Congress, which is the power of the veto. And he has the opportunity to essentially say to Congress, just like Ted Cruz threatened to shut the government down, President Obama could say to Congress, you're not getting any more bridges. There's not going to be any more Republican bridges. There's not going to be any more Republican post offices. Nothing that the Republicans want will pass Congress until I get a fair hearing on my nominee. And it's astounding to me that he has never even contemplated this strategy. I just checked to sort of see how many times he's vetoed legislation. 9 times. Do you know how many times FDR vetoed legislation? 645. And he was dealing with a hostile Congress that fought him tooth and nail, very much like what Obama's doing, yet he doesn't use this check and balance that's actually built into the Constitution. So when I hear people saying, we have to do all these reforms, I agree with a lot of the reforms, but you also need people who are willing to use the power in the system as it is, because the Republicans are using every means at their disposal to block the president, and the president is not fighting the same fight.
Well, it's an interesting question. I'd be interested in your views on
I think
this.
he would say fine. I mean, they would say fine.
Government shutdown.
Yeah, but that makes Obama the leader of the Tea Party. He doesn't have that kind of leverage.
And they're not passing many bills
Yeah,
to
they're
start
not.
with. But also, there's a high level of messaging discipline that both sides are going to need to try to exercise. And he needs to put forward the nominee and make it appear as irrational and obstructionist as he can, that the Senate would do something it hasn't ever done, which is block a nominee and not even hold a hearing for a year. And so I wonder if a tactic like that would make it harder to, I don't know, I think it might cede some of his high ground as a communications matter.
Yeah, and I just think I think that would hurt the things he believes in and the things more Democrats believe in more than it would hurt what the majority of Republicans would want. That particular strategy.
I have a question, and it's for both of you actually, and I'm particularly interested to hear George's answer to this.
Which means I probably won't want to answer it, but that's okay.
And it concerns the so-called low information voter. It seems to me that that's been a fairly back of the hand comment on a lot of what's going on, particularly with respect to Trump supporters. But it's been something we've heard for any number of years, and there's that old song about this country gets exactly what it deserves because of how much attention people pay. I'm interested to know what you think of how responsible the media, particularly the broadcast media, is for its, frankly, in my view, pathetic inquisitions it's made of candidates. I'm disappointed even in the New York Times these days, but how much the media, and particularly the broadcast media, is responsible because of how it has chased. I mean, we see the same Trump rally now carried on cable TV on multiple channels every time there's one, because they know it'll get viewers. But there's nothing being said, and there's no policy really being discussed, and nobody's really challenging the candidate, Trump or anyone else, frankly, on the platitudes they spout over and over again. And how much you think the media is responsible for the low information voter, and frankly, for thereby suppressing turnout?
A lot there. First on that whole issue of the low information voter, I'm actually a little bit more worried about something else right now. I mean, we've always had low information voters. People vote with, I think they're actually pretty smart about it. They generally get what they want, but it's not necessarily based on detailed study of any candidate's policy positions. They basically have a sense of where most candidates stand on the issues and which side they're on. In fact, the lowest information voters are the few that are chased at the end of the election. Most 94 to 96% of voters in a presidential election make up their minds 2 years before the vote for the general election. You're fighting over the final 4 or 5% who pay the least amount of attention to the candidates, have the least involvement in politics, and maybe don't even want to vote at the end. And one of the things we're seeing more and more, and I think it's a little bit in both parties, but I don't want to be falsely even-handed. There's definitely more of a problem right now among Republican voters of people willing to vote on not on no information, but on information that is actually provably false. Whether it's, you've got 60% of Republican primary voters who still question whether or not President Obama was born a citizen, was born in the United States, and Trump has actually played on all of that, and he's willing to throw out all kinds of internet rumors at any time. Where I agree with you on the fact that we've definitely broadcast his views. In part because he's getting support, in part because he's a great entertainer, in part because he does draw eyeballs. Frankly, it's in part because he's willing to do it. I mean, I call every candidate every day, want them to be on, and he's the one who will come on every day. I think I've interviewed him 33 times since June. Where I disagree with you is that it's wrong that he hasn't been pressed. It's absolutely wrong. He's been pressed on every single issue. And whether it's the fact that he doesn't say how he's going to deport the 11 million, or how he's going to build the wall, or how he's going to get Mexico to pay for it, or whether he's actually saying that President Bush lied about WMD or not, or whether he's for impeaching the president, or whether he's for David Duke or not. The question, he gives all the answers that for any other candidate in any other year, I guarantee you would be disqualifying within 3 days. They'd be out of the race. For whatever reason, I think this goes to to what we were talking about before. There is a group of voters out there who see someone getting pressed, see someone embarrassed, see someone who says something that is not true, and then is called out on it by the media and say, the media is wrong, he's right, I'm with him.
See, and allow me to defend the media on this. I'll take it on. First of all, I don't really buy the idea of the low information voter. I think that, generally speaking, voters have as much information as they want to have and need, and that they're actually voting not based on personality, but much more frequently on issues and interests. And I might not like it, but I think the voters who are voting for Trump are voting for him because they agree with him, or finally feel someone saying the things they want to say.
Or agree with his style.
His style. But when he refused to distance himself from David Duke, after having done it previously, that wasn't a gaffe. That was a get out the vote strategy. And so I think that the voters, it's not merely that they're being entertained to death. I also think it's really important to remember that if the other candidates aren't going to raise these charges, whether we want the media to raise them or not, it's not ultimately principally their job. And in the Republican Party right now, until very recently, none of the candidates decided that their strategy was to take on Donald Trump on the very things that George just mentioned. They had their chess game of shooting each other and everything. So I think that if the other candidates aren't raising these issues, it's a lot to expect the media to, whereas on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders has raised a bunch of issues, and Hillary Clinton has had to respond to them because the candidates and their supporters have done it. There's another thing that I encourage people to think about. Now, ABC is a broadcast network, but one of the things that's happened in this polarization that we have politically is we're now have these two self-contained, ideologically homogeneous echo chambers in a way we haven't had in a century in this country. It was like this in the 1800s, where all the newspapers were partisan. But if you think about ABC or another broad, non-ideological national network proclaiming somebody to be wrong, people won't necessarily believe it.
It actually happens. I mean, it goes back to the fact-checking. I mean, you're getting at something very real here, which I don't have an answer to. Donald Trump has said half a dozen things that are provably false. One of them, he saw with his own eyes thousands of people in New Jersey protesting or celebrating after 9/11. There's zero evidence of it. And that's been pointed out literally thousands of times. Doesn't seem to matter to anyone. And then on top of that, this has been evolving too. You think that sort of fact-checking is our job, and it is, but for a lot of the voters, particularly in primaries, if the fact that we say something means it's not true. I mean, everybody is working on their own sets of facts.
We've talked about this before. Think about something like Watergate. Watergate, among other things, was brought to the fore by institutions like the Washington Post and CBS News that people really trusted. If Watergate happened now, you'd have the Republican cable networks and talk shows rallying around Nixon nonstop, and the Democrats being ready for impeachment from the first minute. And everybody would go into their corners. And the moment in Watergate when, at some point, Nixon's supporters said, you know what, it's time, we've got to do something about this, it's hard to imagine that happening.
And you're seeing a tiny version of that now where just yesterday, for the first time, Speaker Paul Ryan and Leader McConnell came out, even though they wouldn't say his name, they sort of said, there's no room in our party for anyone who coddles David Duke or encourages this kind of white supremacism. Look how long that took.
Well, and the leadership, I would argue, of that party winked at Trump's birtherism for all those months when John Boehner, as Speaker, would not say, oh, of course President Obama was born in the United States, and why have we never asked this about any other president? There was, just as with Joe McCarthy, there was a willingness to let the rambunctious people out there do this sort of thing.
Is there, totally different. Is there any reason for optimism on the voting rights of the millions of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals, most of whom are
The question is about the voting rights of those who've been incarcerated and people with felony convictions. And there is actually room for optimism. This is something that is a legacy of Jim Crow. There's millions of people in the United States who cannot vote because of a past criminal conviction. I'm not talking about people who are in prison, but who were in prison. They're back in the community, they're paying taxes, might be working, and yet they might not be able to vote. And as people recognize across the ideological terrain that there's something wrong with our criminal justice system, that we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population, that we have a problem of mass incarceration, people understand that that manifests itself in our democracy too. And so there's actually a heartening left-right coalition to deal with felony disenfranchisement. One of the leaders on this is Rand Paul. The Brennan Center works on this and has all over the country. We have always worked with the conservative evangelicals, Chuck Colson, when he was alive, and others. And there's progress even in the last month while the governor of Maryland vetoed a bill that was overridden and 40,000 people got their voting rights back. So in a number of these areas, if we can get out of the partisan sniping, there's actually broad agreement on things like modernizing the voter registration system, addressing felony disenfranchisement, and some of these other things. There are issues like voter ID that have become much more partisan, but even that actually could be addressed much more easily because there are many ways to require ID that don't disenfranchise anybody. So I again think that this moment of attention and backlash and ferocious focus on how the system's working can be a time when you have forward movement in rather dramatic ways.
Michael's going to sign books. We have time for one more question.
So, listening to you both, something occurred to me that I'd never thought of. Citizens United has enraged much of the population because that kind of money was going to impact media buy, what you could spend, how you could sway people. And yet you have Donald Trump, who has spent $1.50. Who's responsible for giving him the airtime and allowing him? Are there actually too many debates? Is it that you guys are interviewing him? Is it that there isn't an opportunity for voters to actually hear every night or every day on the web, on the news, what the boring candidates are saying? Because Trump, the media is playing. CNN runs ads every night that makes the debate sound like it's prize
There was a
fighting.
huge debate over this in the Republican Party over last time. They thought there were too many debates last time. And that fueled candidates like Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann, who had no business being in a presidential election, but they had their moment in the sun because they could perform pretty well in a single debate. So they had this huge controversy. The head of the RNC was able to get his job and keep his job only because he figured out a way to limit the number of debates this time around. Now look what happened. You limit the number of debates. You have 6 or 7, I think, that were scheduled. And then in mid-August, Fox News puts up a debate and gets 23 million people watching. 23 million people watch a Republican primary debate on a Thursday night. There's no primetime shows that get 23 million people. The Oscars get 34 million people. That is 1/6 of the Super Bowl.
And was that because Trump was in it, or because
Yes.
Republicans were ready to be done with Obama?
It was Donald Trump, and that was when he was just starting to ride the wave. And then the next one gets 22 million. And then people are watching these debates. That's supposedly what we want, is for everybody engaged in our democracy, and they're watching and learning from it and deciding on it. And the one time, actually, this goes to your point, but I think it speaks more to his weird skill than anything else. He's a great debater, and he's he's got great timing. He did the worst in the caucuses when he skipped the debate.
And he's improving as a debater and a candidate too, which
Mostly,
is also.
although we'll see how that plays out. But yeah,
But
I gotta go. You're gonna sign books.
anyway, thank you, George.